and welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and I took it upon myself to build the silliest commander deck of all time. Now, of course, this is completely subjective. Is it actually the silliest commander deck? I don't know. There certainly is a lot of silly ones out there that I'm sure people have or have made, and I did this for a number of reasons. First of all, I think that it's a really neat deck building challenge to do things like this. It's fun, especially if you like building decks like I do. Also, there is a chance that somebody might actually want to grab this deck and play it themselves. Maybe if your play group also has a lot of these silly deck ideas that it can fit nicely into a game. But mostly I'm making this video as a sort of learning process for making a deck work, whether it be I'm going to build around a specific card or I'm going to build around a specific commander where it's really difficult to make it work, and how am I going to take advantage of what that card is doing, right? And that's what I did here. Is I built around a specific card, a really goofy fringe old card called Raiding Party. 2 and a red enchantment. Raiding Party can't be the target of white spells or abilities from white sources. That's not bad, actually, right? If you think about enchantment removal in the format, most of it is going to be white, so that is going to be pretty handy. Also, it is likely that any white player at the table is going to be the one wanting to get this off the table, and the reason why is because of that second ability, which is what we're going to be building around. Sacrifice an orc. That's right, the activation for this ability is sacrificing an orc. So this, as far as I know, is the only sort of orc tribal card in the whole entire game. But what is it doing? Each player may tap any number of untapped white creatures they control. For each creature tapped this way, that player chooses up to 2 planes. Then destroy all planes that weren't chosen this way by any player. What a weird, funny, interesting card. So first of all, it's weird in that it is an enchantment with an activated ability. That's always kind of weird when you see that. They used to do this way more back in the day. Again, it's probably the only actual orc tribal sort of card that we have in Magic. But of course, it is also destroying planes, and that is what we're going to be building around here. Now, I know people will say, okay, well, destroying lands isn't very fun in the Commander format. Well, it's going to be funny here, that's for sure, because this deck is going to be built around destroying our own lands. That's right. Relying on our opponents to have planes in play is not a great strategy for any deck, and if we build our deck around that, what if our opponents aren't playing white at all? Our deck is going to sit there doing literal nothing, right? We don't have a white version of a Yavimaya or an Urborg. If we did, we could more build around that strategy. I'm looking at this card and I'm like, man, this is such an interesting card. How could you build a deck around it? And the only way that is consistent, I think, is to destroy our own lands. That is what makes this deck really, really silly. Is the strategy behind this deck is destroying our own lands. So how am I going to do this? Well, first of all, because I want to destroy my own lands, obviously I want to be playing white, and the commander for this deck is going to be Gerard Weatherlight Hero. I couldn't really find any commander that specifically fit this theme. I thought this was a decent one. It is sort of fitting what we are doing a little bit, which I will get more to, but we are a Boros deck here, right? Obviously we need the red for our Raiding Party, and we need the white because we want planes in play that we are going to be destroying. Now, of course, we are building around a certain card in the 99 of our deck, so we got to get it. Fortunately for us, again, white fits really nicely here because we get all those white tutors that can go get enchantments like Enlightened Tutor, Academy Rector. We also got Moon Blessed Cleric, Idyllic Tutor. It shouldn't be super difficult to get our Raiding Party, although I have play tested this deck and it does actually work relatively well if you don't get your Raiding Party, right? You don't have to entirely rely on it. I do want to make it so that it isn't entirely necessary for me to have it. I can still do stuff if I don't get it. Now, of course, Raiding Party wants us to be sacrificing an orc in order to activate that ability, so we will need some orcs. I found some pretty good ones. Coercive Recruiter is pretty decent. 4 and a red orc pirate, 4/3. When it enters the battlefield, or another pirate, even though we don't really have a lot of pirates in this deck, gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap that creature. Until end of turn, it gains haste and becomes a pirate in addition to its other types. What would be really funny here is if this ETB'd and our opponent had an orc that we could gain control of and then sacrifice it to our Raiding Party. Fringe scenario, but could happen. happen. White Plume Adventurer. That's right. White does have orcs indeed. 2 and a white orc cleric, 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, you get the initiative. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, untap a creature you control. If you've completed a dungeon, untap all creatures you control instead. So just a pretty good card. It also happens to be an orc. Orcish Squatters is one of my personal favorites from back in the day, which kind of actually does fit the theme of what we're doing here. 4 and a red orc, 2/3. When it attacks and isn't blocked, you may gain control of target land defending player controls for as long as you control Orcish Squatters. If you do, it deals no combat damage this turn. So it kind of fits the lands theme that we are doing here. And of course, we can play those changelings as well, like Taurine Mauler and Mirror Entity. Just great cards in any commander deck, but also have every creature type, so we can sacrifice them to our raiding party if we need to. Now, after we destroy all our lands, how are we taking advantage of that, right? We got to take advantage of the fact that we are blowing up all of our lands. And of course, I think the best way to do that is to get a whole bunch of landfall triggers all at once. And of course, we can do that by getting all those lands we destroyed right back into play, and Faith's Reward and Second Sunrise will do that. The idea here of the deck is I sacrifice that orc, blow up all my planes. Say I got 6 of them in play. They all go to the graveyard. I can Faith's Reward, Second Sunrise. They all immediately come back into play, and then I get a whole bunch of landfall triggers. It also fits, I'm bringing back all my artifacts, my creatures, and my enchantments as well. So, all of these cards are very handy in a commander game in general, because if someone just casts a board wipe, blows a bunch of stuff up, we can handle that situation as well with these cards. Planar Birth is one that is going to deal specifically with lands. 1 and a white sorcery, return all basic land cards from all graveyards to the battlefield tapped under their owner's control. So I should point out, if someone else has planes in play, which is entirely likely, we will be blowing that up as well. So if you use your raiding party and your opponent is playing a mono white deck, that's really going to suck for them. Not super fun, not super casual. Planar Birth and maybe Second Sunrise as well will do this, where they will get their lands back as well. You can not do that if you want to just be mean and blow up their lands. Anyone that has like those triomes, those are planes, they will get blown up, and they're not basic lands, so the Planar Birth will not bring them back. So you can advantage yourself here, right? Where I'm going to blow up all the planes. I will hit some of my opponent's non-basic lands. If they're playing like a 3-color deck, like a Naya deck, they're going to probably have a few planes in play, whether they be basic lands or the non-basic versions. Blowing those up can be an advantage for you, right? If you want, you can cast maybe a Planar Birth. They get their basic lands back, or Second Sunrise will get their non-basic lands back as well. It depends how you want to play out the deck. I will also point out there is that stipulation there where your opponent can protect their lands by tapping their white creatures, right? So just tapping 1 white creature is going to protect 2 planes. So the chances that we're blowing up all of our opponent's planes isn't really that great. It's really not the point of the deck, just might be added bonus, right? At the end of the day, the point here is we blow up our planes so that we can get them all back with one of these effects, and taking advantage of that with a card like Skyclave Geopede, for example, right? 2 and a red insect, 3/1 with trample. When a land enters the battlefield under your control, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So if we have 6 planes get destroyed, we bring them all back all at once. Our Skyclave Geopede gets +12/+12 until end of turn. It's now going to be a 15/13. That's pretty good, right? Again, this is a really janky deck, but that's pretty decent payoff for getting this combo off. And of course, we're going to want to do it more than once. Tunneling Geopede and Spirefire Lagic. Again, these are the win cons in the deck, right? This is how we're going to win. Both of these, when a land enters the battlefield under your control, are going to deal 1 damage to each opponent. So again, 6 lands coming back into play, going to deal 6 damage to each of our opponents. Not too shabby. Felidar Retreat, of course, great landfall effect in white. We can either be making those cat tokens, or we can be putting +1/+1 counters on our creatures. Emiria Shepherd is really the best one. I have playtested this deck a couple times. Things really get out of hand fast if you have your Emiria Shepherd in play. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may return target non-land permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. Pretty good. But if that land is a plains, which of course it will, you may return that non-land permanent card to the battlefield instead. And I think you can kind of see where things are going here, right? What we can do if our Emiria Shepherd is in play, of course, we're going to be blowing up our plains. And if we can return them to play, we're going to be getting a whole bunch of triggers off our Emiria Shepherd. And we can even get our orc back that we sacrificed if we want to use our raiding party again. Just return a whole bunch of stuff from our graveyard back into play. Fits sort of the recursion-like theme that we have in the deck already. You really can get some crazy things going with your Emiria Kamiria Shepherd in play and getting all those landfall triggers off of your planes. Another interesting thing we can do here is Scholarship Sponsor, and I have a couple of effects like this in the deck where white wants your opponents to have more lands than you, of course, but this by far is the best one. 3 and a white Human Advisor 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, each player who controls fewer lands than the player who controls the most lands searches their library for a number of basic land cards less than or equal to the difference, puts those cards on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. So what we can do here again is blow up all our planes, then we cast our Scholarship Sponsor and go get a bunch of lands out of our library, put them directly into play. Of course, we're going to be getting all those landfall triggers there as well. And then after we've got the trigger off of our Scholarship Sponsor, we get all the lands back out of the graveyard that we just blew up, right? So we're getting a whole lot of landfall triggers, also getting a ton of mana in play as well. Let's not forget about that. A couple other really funny, interesting includes in the deck. Celestial Dawn. What an interesting, funny, unique card, and I finally found a good way to use it. 1 white enchantment. Lands you control are planes. That's right. This card will just turn all of our lands into planes. Of course, we are going to be having lands in play that aren't planes, usually, like mountains, for example. A couple non-basic lands as well in this deck. This is going to turn all our lands into planes. So now our raiding party will blow up all our lands, which of course is what we want. Non-land permanents you control are white. The same is true for spells you control. Non-land permanents you own that aren't on the battlefield. You may spend white mana as though it were mana of any color. You may spend other mana as though it were colorless mana. So this is going to make it so that we're essentially mana fixed as well. Nice little added upside. Remember, we do have a lot of enchantment search in this deck, so we can go grab this if we want to. Conversion is another really interesting one that just so happens to fit. So 2 white enchantment at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice it unless you pay 2 white. All mountains are plains. So again, what this is going to do is all our mountains that are in play are going to now be plains. So when they get blown up by our raiding party, we're going to have more lands going to the graveyard, which we want. But also now all of our opponents that have mountains in play are going to be hurt by this, right? So again, this can be a way that we can more advantage ourselves. If our opponent are playing red decks, now we can slap this down. All their mountains now become plains, which is going to make it harder for them to cast stuff, of course, but then also their lands are going to get blown up by our raiding party, and they probably don't have white creatures that they can be tapping either. Someone's playing a mono red deck, they're just going to lose all their lands if we have this in play, right? So this is another way we can go with this. And of course, we got to have backups for what we're doing. I threw Zuran Orb in the deck. To be entirely honest, this is the easier way to go about it, right? Because we could just sacrifice all our lands, gain 2 life for all of them, and then do what we're doing anyway in the deck. It's the less fun version. It's a less interesting version, but we certainly can do it. We can use our Zuran Orb to sacrifice all our lands rather than blowing them up. But I wanted to do a fun, silly, interesting version built around a card that I just find to be very fascinating. Again, we could blow up our opponent's planes here, I guess, but relying on that to build around with this card is not going to be very consistent at all, and it's not super fun either. So I like the strategy of I'm blowing up my own lands with raiding party, right? So essentially the silliness of this deck is I'm building around this card, but also the silliness is I'm blowing up my own lands. How can I take advantage of that? And that's how I went about building this deck. Is first of all, I got to figure out a way I can use this card, and once I figure out a good way to use this card, how can I take advantage of that thing that I am doing, which happens to be blowing up my own lands, which I think is pretty silly. If you are interested in playing this very silly deck at all, the deck list is in the description below, of course. Feel free to take it a spin. It's a really interesting one. That is it for today, though, and thanks for tuning in.